Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this session. My name is Yudhishthir Raj Isar. I was born and raised in India. I work at UNESCO and I'm therefore a citizen of the world. And as a citizen of the world, I'm very struck by the degree to which the theme of this session is really at the intersection of two global trends. The first global trend is the worldwide explosion of cultural awareness, which includes a particular attachment to the physical objects and structures, the loci of group memory, les lieux de mémoire, as they say in French, that embody our shared cultural heritage, as well as the identity of each group that makes up this interactive mosaic. The second global trend is the resurgence of ethics and values that makes the discussion here at Davos, as Raymond Barre pointed out yesterday, so completely different today than it would have been 10 years ago. Each one of the very distinguished speakers that I have the honor to introduce to you this afternoon will be exploring the theme of cultural heritage in this ethical perspective. 4 of these speakers will be doing so with particular reference to the clandestine art trade, and therefore with reference to the movement of objects across the globe. First, the distinguished archaeologist Lord Colin Renfrew, who is already known to many of us here from earlier sessions, who is going to explore the way that illicit excavations mean loss of context, hence loss of information, and discuss the moral imperative to decline to buy looted objects for the sake of the shared heritage of humankind. He will be followed by a distinguished scholar of Renaissance art, professor of art history at the Institute of Advanced Study, Professor Irving Levin, who, for his part, will explore some of the contradictions inherent in efforts to limit or eliminate illicit international art trafficking. He will be followed by Thomas Krenz, who's a distinguished scholar of art and museum manager, who's the director of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, who's going to look at a very specific case, the case of a stolen Chagall gouache, the resolution of which, as a legal case, has had an important impact on precedent concerning property rights. He will be followed by Harold Williams, who is a distinguished manager and philanthropist, president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust, who's going to look, I think, at the systemic complexity of the problems and remind us that we need to look not just at one single sector of the art trade when we discuss this issue. And finally, Professor Ikkyo Hiroyama, who is president of the Tokyo National University of Fine Arts and Music, a distinguished art historian and painter, whose beautiful work we have been able to admire here. He is going to take a much broader perspective on cultural heritage and propose a whole new approach to the conservation of the heritage, both movable and immovable, both tangible and intangible. The rules of the game for these sessions is that each one of us speaks for 7 or 8 minutes. These presentations will be followed by at least 30 minutes of discussion, questions and comments from the floor. And at the end, I'm going to ask each speaker whether, in the light of the discussion, he would like to come back to a particular point or summarize. What I'm going to do now is very briefly set the stage, if you like, for the first main block of discussion, which has to do with the movement of cultural property. Now, as we all know, At any one moment, today, as ever in history, countless transactions involving cultural property are taking place and have taken place. Many of them are perfectly legal and are vital to the diffusion of cultural knowledge for all. At the same time, there are many transactions which are illegal and which are increasingly regarded as morally reprehensible. Recent examples include the shattering outflow of icons and religious art from Central and Eastern Europe since the opening of the borders there, the looting of the National Museum in Kabul, Afghanistan, the illegal conversion of sacred textiles from Bolivia for commercial purposes, and the pillaging of ancient terracottas from completely unresearched archaeological sites in Mali. Since the 1960s, it has been clear that, try as it may, no victim country can stem the tide on its own. That is why UNESCO adopted in 1970 the Convention, and this is a cumbersome legal title, the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. This convention is the only universal legal instrument of its kind. There are 81 states party to the convention, but most of these states are victim states. Of those which have a substantial market in cultural objects of foreign origin, only a few have signed the convention. Now, as any international convention goes, this one obviously places requirements on governments. And governments have begun to respond very well to the requirements of this convention because it is flexible. At present, many European nations, following the directive and regulation on the return of cultural property within the European Union, are rethinking their approach to the illicit trade. However, as an appeal to fight illicit trade in cultural property, which has just been launched by Mr. Federico Mayor, the Director General of UNESCO, who left us this morning, points out, the strength of the art market in the industrialized countries, and I'm quoting, acts as a magnet to the flow of trade, licit and illicit. Only the utmost diligence on the part of museums, collectors, and dealers in these countries will therefore prevent traffickers and speculators in illegally gotten goods from passing them into the legitimate market. This key idea is increasingly recognized today. We must re-examine the ethics of the art trade. 10 years ago, this is not the case today, but 10 years ago, I was the frustrated missionary of this idea in UNESCO. And I couldn't have imagined that 10 years ago, I would have had a press clippings file from just a few months of press articles on this issue, that it would be as thick as this. In addition to the general factors which explain this, there's some very specific factors. First, the stiffening of resolve on the part of the victim countries. Secondly, the fact that industrialized countries in Central and Eastern Europe have now fallen victim to this process, which previously was seen almost exclusively as a north-south process. Thirdly, the leadership of the United States, which, for reasons essentially of cultural diplomacy in its own backyard, that is, the insistence of Latin American countries on steps to combat illicit traffic, the leadership of the United States in its own legislation, because the United States has ratified the UNESCO Convention, has been very significant. And finally, the subject has been brought out by the opening of archives on wartime looting, both on the part of the Nazi regime as well as on the part of the Soviets. 10 years ago, a pronouncement such as the following, which comes from the director of archaeology at Boston University, would have been unthinkable. And this is Ricardo Elia, and I quote, "I have often wondered," he says, "I have often wondered why the great collectors of ancient art, most of whom are highly educated and socially prominent people, are so willing to publicly engage in an activity that is widely known to be mired in criminality, corruption, and sleaziness. Every serious collector knows that the object he or she purchased in all likelihood came from a clandestine excavation or was stolen. In either case, it was probably smuggled out of the country of origin. The only way to make a dent in the looting problem is to reduce the demand for antiquities by bringing about a change in social attitude. An extremist position, you might say. However, I'm going to be able to quote Lord Renfrew before giving him the floor. Lord Renfrew, in a collection of articles on this issue, said this: "To bring about a general change in perception will be a difficult task, especially since in undertaking it, archaeologists will have to do battle with all the vested interests of the art and antiquities trade, for whom the high prestige of collecting as an activity is an important business asset." Lord Renfrew is now going to tell you why it is necessary, why he thinks it is necessary to do this battle and to bring about this general change. Lord Renfrew, I give you the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin with what I think is an important proposition, that the true cultural heritage is our knowledge and our understanding of the past. And my central point today is that knowledge and understanding do not come from art objects in complete isolation. In my talk, I'm focusing on antiquities and what they can tell us about the human past. And so I would assert that ownership is not the main issue here. The issue is that the lust for ownership of collectors and museums leads to illicit digging, that is to say, looting. And by looting in this context, I mean the illicit excavation of antiquities. If I could have the first slide, please, die erste Diapositive bitte. The illicit trafficking and the sale of looted antiquities has been established as second only to the sale of drugs in the turnover of profits ultimately coming from crime, because illicit excavation and illegal export are indeed crimes in the countries of origin, although the sign of looted antiquities is the sale of looted antiquities. Could we have some focus, please? What I'm trying to show you here is the Sevso treasure, which was offered for sale by Sotheby's in London just a year ago, and then was drawn from the market for legal reasons. I'll try and take us back one to show you the cover of the Sotheby's catalogue. The Sevso treasure is a Roman silver treasure, and it's not clear whether it was exported from the Lebanon, as originally claimed, indeed originally documented, or found perhaps in Hungary, or found perhaps in Croatia. But its value has been estimated at around £3 or £4 million. The pillaging of our cultural heritage is condoned by governments, facilitated by auction houses and dealers, and ultimately funded, of course, and this is the central point in my words today, ultimately funded by private collectors and by some museums. Now, let me be very clear. The cultural heritage is not just the objects, the antiquities, the artworks. It is also what we learn from these. It is the information, the context. And you need a properly recorded archaeological excavation to establish context, and a rapid publication to make the information known. And of course, illicit excavation, by definition secret, makes that impossible, and it also introduces legal complexities because the country of origin can very rarely demonstrate that it is the country of origin because the objects have been excavated secretly and exported secretly, so there is no way traced back to context, either legal context or archaeological context. Now let me give you a very different example. This golden box, which some of you may recognize, is Greek. It dates from the 4th century BC. If it were put on sale, it would certainly, even if it had no context, it would certainly be worth several $1 million if it were accepted as authentic. Well, it is authentic. It's just a box in isolation, although rather a handsome box and a very old box. But very fortunately, it does come from a context. It was excavated by Professor Manolis Andronikos at Pella in Macedonia, in a tomb where he found cremated bones, where he found fragments of an ivory shield, fragments would have been of no intrinsic value, took a great deal of care to restore the shield, and other objects, some of them beautiful and intrinsically valuable, others not. But study of the context has made it clear that the tomb from which these objects came is in fact the tomb of Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. And the find is one of the greatest finds of recent years because of the assemblage and because it has been possible to document the owner of that box. And here you see the contrast between a single object in isolation, which is a thing of some beauty, and on the other hand, in its context, something that writes for us a new page of history. Now, another example would be a Noke head from West Africa, from Nigeria. And it is the case, as our chairman has already indicated, that West Africa, is being systematically looted, and that means systematically deprived of its past. Because those lootings in Mali of cultures which are hitherto archaeologically not documented means that the information about the African past is disappearing, and Africa is being robbed of an important component of its past. The same is true of the Cycladic islands of Greece, where many magnificent finds have been made, but very few of them in proper contexts. The same is to some extent true, as you know, of the Maya country, where stelae have been stolen, sawn up and exported, and the same is true of Cyprus and many other areas. Well, how to stop, how to diminish this looting? Of course, ideally, it would be policed in the source countries, but you can only go so far with that. The real answer, and it's not an easy one, and I'm sure it will lead to disagreement on the panel, is to stop buying the loot. Now, some collectors inevitably will go on buying, but more museums must follow the British Museum and the University Museum of Philadelphia in announcing and adhering to the policy that they will not buy unprovenanced antiquities unless these can be shown to have been known and published some 40 or 50 years ago. It is important to follow the UNESCO convention to which reference was made earlier. So we have to change the culture of our own society and make collectors ashamed, not proud, to own and display this looted stuff. Now, I was shocked last year when the Royal Academy of Art in London showed the collection formed by the collector Georges Ortiz, which has many remarkable objects like this one, many objects of great beauty, but all of them deprived of their archaeological context, and most of them without provenance. I must be careful what I say in case the lawyers are onto me, but if I say that when an object is without provenance and has emerged recently, there is a risk that it has been looted, I don't think I could be easily contradicted. And I was shocked when I visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art a couple of years ago and saw the Leon Levy and Shelby White collection, which had a remarkable series of beautiful objects, once again of recent appearance on the market, of undoubted authenticity, many of them, and therefore objects about which similar inferences could be drawn. Now, a few years ago, and I'm not trying to put them in the same category, but a few years ago, the Getty Museum bought this kouros, this 6th century Greek sculpture. Its authenticity has been discussed, but let us assume that it is authentic. Now, to do the Getty Museum justice, they had documentation which indicated that this sculpture had indeed been known for some 50 or 60 years. And had that documentation been authentic, then I think the Getty Museum would have been beyond reproach in the matter. Unfortunately, however, it appears that the documentation was not altogether authentic. Whether or not the sculpture is authentic is a different matter, but the documentation was not authentic, and so the Getty Museum finds itself the owner of a sculpture which I would suggest can only have been illicitly excavated in Greece or in Italy. And I think that is an unfortunate situation. And that means that unwittingly, the Getty Museum has rewarded the dealer, and the dealer, of course, paid the looter. I'll just switch on my overhead. So, we must ask the great museums and institutions of the world to clean up their act. We must persuade collectors that buying loot, because that is what these antiquities, however beautiful, are, buying loot is no longer smart. Just as shooting elephants is no longer considered smart. If you go through the stately homes of England, you'll see lions' heads and deer's heads on the walls, but that is no longer considered so fashionable an occupation as it once was. Just as the wearing of sable coats or mink coats is not universally considered smart. Ladies and gentlemen, the past is a diminishing resource. Our hope of knowing it and understanding it is vanishing because of looting and illicit digging. In the last analysis, in terms of responsibility, collectors are the real looters, and it is only there, I think, that a solution can be found. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Renfrew, for your very luminous and trenchant presentation. I would now give the floor to Professor Lavin, who is going to speak to you from his seat.
You can hear me okay? Is this microphone working all right?
Yes.
Good. I want to say from the outset that I'm speaking from a certain position which I would like to define, the position of a professional American historian of art. All three of those things mean something. As a historian of art, I do something rather different from Lord Renfrew as an archaeologist, and so I have a different, not so much different perspective, but different things in view, so to speak. And although, as I hope you'll see, we have a lot more in common than the difference in professional field would indicate. As a professional, it carries another connotation, namely that I have to forewarn you that as a professional, I am not in the least interested in whether works of art are good or are bad or are beautiful or are ugly. I'm interested in the significance of works of art only. And this carries with it, I think, an essentially non-political view of what I do, or at least I would like to think it were non-political. The fact that I'm an American, I think, is a bit significant in this. It reminds me, the best illustration I can give is a wonderful statement by a great art historian of our time, Erwin Panofsky, who, having been expelled from Germany, came to America and described the American experience in one particular respect as very special for him. He came from a world in which people battled bitterly over whether Gothic architecture originated in France or in Germany. The German art historians and the French art historians attacked each other with a kind of political passion. And there in America, he found people who didn't care whether it originated in France or in Germany. They only cared where it originated. And he found this a refreshing point of view from a European perspective. I'm going to speak to three essential topics. If I can do it in quick enough time, you have to stop me if I go too far. I'll try not. One subject the first subject I'd like to address is what I refer to as the localization rationale. That is to say, the rationales that are given for works of art belonging, that is to say, in the possession of one particular place or another. What are the reasonable reasons why works of art should be here rather than there? I have to make a distinction in this discussion, between two kinds of works of art, namely what I would call site-specific works of art on the one hand, and independent works of art on another. We would all agree that there's no problem about there being a sacrilege involved, particularly in the terms that Lord Renfrew was speaking of, namely cultural heritage, if the Sistine ceiling were removed from the Vatican and taken to somewhere else, because it would have been removed from a context which is essential to the sort of thing that I'm interested in, namely how to understand this object. On the other hand, the world is also filled with works of art that were not conceived as the Sistine ceiling was conceived for a specific place and for a specific patron and a specific context. It's quite interesting, just to step aside for one moment, that I'm sure a huge percentage of the Greek pottery that we have in the world, which was made in Greece, made in Athens, or made in Corinth, was actually found in grave sites in Italy, far away from where they were made and by the artists that they were made by. Those artists, I think, on the whole, were delighted at the idea of having their works go out of the country, far and far away. They're pleased to sell them and have them go far and wide. And this is, of course, true throughout much of the history of art from the Renaissance on. So there are works of art that are not only independent, but were specifically made with the idea that they not be local in their permanent, disposition. From my point of view, that is the point of view of the person who studies these things, I think one can divide the kinds of interests we art historians have also in sort of two categories, which I might describe as diachronic and synchronic. If you are interested in the work of a particular artist, or the work of a particular school of artists, or the work of a national tradition of art, you have a vested interest in having as many of those works of art together in the same place at the same time. If I want to study Van Gogh, my purpose is to study the life and history of Van Gogh, which is the way a great deal of art history gets done, including my own, then it's to my best interest to see all the Van Goghs I can possibly get together in the same place, preferably the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. But I might have other interests in the art of Van Gogh. Van Gogh, as you know, worked a lot in the south of France. Not only that, he was deeply, deeply interested by French art. If I want to study the relationship between Van Gogh's paintings and French painting, well, that changes the picture a little bit. It would be much more convenient for me to have Van Gogh's pictures in France, in the context in which much of their spiritual content was conceived. If I have another point of view, he painted in the south of France. He made these wonderful landscapes of Provence. If I have a particular interest in the relationship between Van Gogh's painting and the landscapes in which they were painted, then I would like to have his paintings right there in south of France, where he made them, next to the landscapes in which he painted them. So that our interest in the localization, in the rationale of localization, tends to shift with the kind of interest that we have. There is another kind of interest altogether, which especially is becoming important more and more in our time for lots of reasons that are reasons that also relate to our own subject today. And those are what I would call synchronic studies. It has become very much a subject of interest to historians, to anthropologists, to all sorts of people, to make comparative cultural studies. just to give a slight example, there is in the whole classification of pre-Columbian pottery, just to give one case, that's called classical. The classical art of Maya is a term which is used for this. Well, the term classical in that context is borrowed from the study of Greek art, of classical art, so that it is not simply a term that represents a chronological distinction. It also is a term that has substantive meaning, and a substantive meaning that is remarkably related in many contexts to classical art in Greece. It is now becoming an interesting and serious study to study the relationships between the cultural processes that produce the classical art of the Maya and the cultural processes that produce the classical art of Greece. If I want to study that relationship, I assure you that by far the best place to study it would not be in Latin America, nor would it be in Greece. It would be in London or in New York, where I have all of that together in one place and can make the study. It reminds me of a young person I met years ago who was studying exotic and tropical diseases. Exotic tropical diseases. He was studying them in New York. And I asked him, "What are you doing here in New York studying exotic and tropical diseases?" Well, he said, "Anyone in my field knows that you can find more tropical diseases, more different tropical diseases in the city of New York than you can in any other spot on Earth." So that it had this melting pot of America had a very particular kind of interest for this particular study. I, as a professional American art historian, have to come to the conclusion that in the end there is little real scientific basis for any localization rationale. Scientific basis, I say. That does not mean that there is no basis for a localization rationale. There is a profound and deep, and above all, I think, the most moving and the most important criterion for a localization rationale, and that's something to which I and many other people give the term national cultural heritage, which is a term that should be very carefully distinguished from Lord Renfrew's use of cultural heritage. I'm speaking of national cultural heritage. This notion of national cultural heritage is a wonderful one. It's one in which I share and for which I have a great respect, and which is one that is growing ever more powerful in its impact on our society. It has a history. It is intimately bound up with the notion of nationalism in itself. It's in the end, it has a long etiology, of course, but in the end, ultimately, it's the product of 19th century romantic nationalism, political nationalism, which in the course of the 19th century made an association with political nationalism and ethnic or cultural nationalism. The two came together and created a marriage which I think is described under the term national cultural heritage. And I think that this idea of a national cultural heritage is today the prime rationalization for localization. Let's see if I can now abbreviate what I tried to say. It's a dangerous concept. It was the concept that motivated many of the cultural crimes of the Nazis, which were based on this notion of a national cultural heritage. It leads to most extraordinary kinds of ideas. On the one hand, it leads to the idea that the British Museum should return the Elgin marbles because the Elgin marbles belong to the national cultural heritage of Greece. On the other hand, it leads to the idea that Great Britain should not allow to exit from Great Britain a painting by Titian, which is in Great Britain because some wealthy collector collected it and paid money for it in Italy a couple of hundred years ago. This process of acquiring this work of art for good, hard money and bringing it to England has had the ironic effect of making this work by Titian part of the national cultural heritage of Great Britain. Ironically, the collector can be described in that context as a national cultural hero. I would like to now take up, nevertheless, as I say, this motivation to protect works of art in this context, it is not the context that Lord Renfrew is speaking about, because I'll come to that in 1 second. It's very much here and has produced the entire process that we are now examining of an attempt to control legally this process of exploration and exportation of works of art. What to do about it? I cannot resist telling you a marvelous story from my own background that took place about 15 years ago in a discussion with a number of young Italian archaeologists who were deeply, deeply concerned with the problem that Lord Renfrew is talking about. To this day, I'm sure every night somewhere in Italy, some grave is robbed, and the works of art, the objects in it, because we'll see what that means, are taken, isolated from their context, and sold on the market, mainly through Swiss dealers. We all know that, everyone whom we know, and so on. That this is still happening. These archaeologists were representatives of the extreme political left. They were what were called Maoists. And they had this idea, that the idea of art was a bad thing altogether. There should be no art market. There is no such thing as art. What these objects in the graves that they wanted to protect for their context were objects of material culture. They had the following solution to the problem. These extreme left-wing Marxists. The government of Italy should legalize excavation. It should make the process of excavation legal and controllable, so that those who excavate could become, in some kind of sense, legitimate entrepreneurs, so to speak, but under government surveillance, so that the excavations could be properly surveyed, properly carried out, the crucial context preserved and recorded as it should be, and then the government would enter into a sort of 50-50 arrangement with the excavators. They could keep 50%, the government would keep 50%, and the diggers would keep 50% and be perfectly free to sell them. This was an ironic twist. It's not what you'd expect from the extreme left, but that was their idea. It never came about. It was an ironic twist because it represented a return to the basis on which the great German excavations at the end of the 19th century throughout the Mediterranean were actually agreed upon with the governments of Turkey and of Greece. You find the German museums full of these wonderful objects that were part of excavations, and they were brought quite legitimately on the basis of 50-50 agreements between them. Well, I think I will stop there. I'm sorry to have gone so long, but it gives some idea.
Professor Levin, I'm really sorry that I had to ask you to stop. You know, what you've shown us is, it ain't that simple. That is, the complexities of these issues are such that we could speak for hours instead of the 45 minutes, more or less, that we have left. But I thank you very, very much for those very thought-provoking remarks. I'm going to now ask Dr. Thomas Krenz to take the floor, and he's going to speak about, as I mentioned earlier, a very specific case that has all sorts of interesting implications. Dr. Krenz.
Thank you. To preface my comments on, or to preface my description of this case, I think it's important to recognize the complexity of these issues. Mr. Isar, Lord Renfrew, and Professor Levin have sketched out a universe that's increasingly complex because the points of view are so different and diverge in many fundamental ways. Clearly, the intentions and directions of collectors are substantially different than those of governments that perhaps regard themselves as owners of antiquities in the beginning, and that these perspectives are different from art historians, which subtly but substantially are different from archaeologists, and on it can go. Perhaps at this point, one of the most important features of this discussion is, in fact, the scale of the debate. As Mr. Isar pointed out, that the literature is vast and increasing. The very fact that these issues would be a topic of discussion at this Congress are an indication of its importance. The question that I would pose, are there any indications of where this debate is taking us? And I would offer two examples of an approach that is refining and even narrowing, perhaps, the field of activity and the limits of action by these various and different interest groups. Clearly, in the last few years, the aggressive position taken by the government of Turkey with respect to the repatriation of art objects that cannot be fully documented has been a very successful national policy. It's been funded at a national level, it's been aggressively pursued, and it has led in many instances to the return to Turkey of major artifacts and antiquities that in different circumstances had made their way out of the country. It might be interesting and somewhat ironic, however, to note that the field of litigation on which this successful action by the Turkish government has been predicated is relatively slender but growing. And there was one significant development that took place over the last 5 years that did involve the Guggenheim Museum and has resulted in a precedent-setting determination by the court in the state of New York. Briefly, the details of the case are these. In 1965, a gouache by Chagall disappeared from the museum. At the time, it was a decision by the administration of the museum not to report the disappearance of the work of art, figuring that it would only drive it further underground. 22 years later, in 1987, the work of art appeared on the wall of a collector about 5 blocks from the Guggenheim Museum. And it came to the attention of the Guggenheim when the collector indeed had taken the gouache to Sotheby's for an appraisal for insurance purposes. The Sotheby's person recognized the work as the missing Guggenheim Chagall, and it was a relatively modest work, and brought it to the attention of the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim approached the new owner for its return. The new owner refused, saying that the work had been acquired in good faith, and that had been in fact in their possession for over 20 years, or for 20 years exactly, and indeed that the Guggenheim had somehow abdicated its ownership by failing to report and aggressively pursue the return of the work of art. It turns out what had happened is that the thief who had worked in the museum sold the work of art to a dealer. The dealer sold it to a second dealer, slightly higher in the food chain, with a greater reputation. By 1987, both dealers had died, so it was essentially the institution and the collector. When the case went to trial, the Guggenheim lost, because the existing law at that time indicated that, in fact, the court interpreted that the Guggenheim's lack of pursuit had forced a consideration of the statute of limitation, which was 3 years, and by not pursuing, the Guggenheim had abdicated its rights for the work. Upon appeal, however, the appeals court reversed the judgment of the court in the first case, indicated that there was no statute of limitation on, not on the grounds in terms of the law, but that the precedent of statute of limitations was inappropriate. The case went back to trial, and at the second trial, the Guggenheim won. Now, what was significant about this is that it established the issue of property rights in terms of works of art over a relatively ambiguous time frame. And while this doesn't appeal, this does not it's not concerned directly with antiquities. Clearly the case had a significant impact on establishing a precedent, a legal precedent, for how to deal with antiquities. While the Metropolitan Museum certainly has not acknowledged this, it was sensed in New York at the time, given the attention that this case received, both in the legal community and in the museum community, that this would make it more difficult to retain the ownership of works of art of some questionable provenance when an aggressive case was being made, in this case by the Turkish government, for the return of works of art. Now, I think that the point here, and I say with some irony because it was a work of modern painting, I think that this case clearly has taken a step. It's not a major step, but it is a step in establishing a body of precedent. And it's the body of that legal precedent, together with political pressures, together with the philosophical, art historical, and social debate, that will, in fact, eventually probably lead to some international accord that governs the flow of works of art and the return of antiquities and stolen properties. And this process that we're involved in today, I think, is very much part of that. The issues have to be explored fully. They will be used, and by the arguments will be used by different quarters in different ways, but that what will probably evolve slowly will be an international policy as these forces are rubbing up against each other and seek their resolution in the courts. Thank you.
Dr. Krenz, thank you very much for having been able to so quickly and so ably get into an area where I ventured not to tread, which is that of some of the legal nuances. And you've done that beautifully. Thank you very much. And I would now like to ask Dr. Harold Williams to take the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As a former lawyer, I won't tread on the legal area either. I think Dr. Lavin has addressed one of the issues that I wanted to touch on, so I'll leave it alone, and that is the importance of context as stressed from the archaeological standpoint. I might begin by indicating that we at the Getty and the Getty Museum is one of a number of activities of the Getty Trust, another one of which is the Getty Conservation Institute, which is involved worldwide in a number of areas of training and conservation of cultural heritage, essentially in specific projects literally around the world, including, I might note, training programs entitled Management of Archaeological Sites and Preservation of Archaeological Sites, both of which suggest that archaeologists themselves have a lot to learn about how to manage an excavation and to be concerned about what happens after the site has been excavated. And we know so many places around the world where sites which have been excavated are allowed to deteriorate and decay, and in that sense, we've lost a lot, again, of the knowledge and the heritage that we're designed and committed to conserving. Let me touch on two of the objects that were displayed by Lord Renfrew to give you an idea of the, you might say, on-the-ground complexity. We were offered the Sevso treasures before any others were, as far as I know. They came to us with export licenses from Lebanon. On their face, valid. But we were not satisfied. We sent a legal representative to Lebanon, found that they were indeed authentic licenses. The signatures on the licenses were authentic. But apparently the person who signed it, as we found as we dug further, had no authority to sign it. So in some fashion, he had been paid to issue licenses. And we backed away. We wouldn't touch it. The Kouros, which you saw raised, it's interesting, Lord Renfrew, I appreciate your endorsement of the authenticity of the piece. The Kouros was presented to us with an elaborate provenance. Again, in the interest of being cautious, we sent investigators to Switzerland, talked to the individuals who were still alive, who had participated and who were identified in the provenance, and it all looked fine. We bought the piece, and some 2 years later stumbled on what appeared to be an insignificant fact, but as we explored it, the entire provenance fell apart. Now, when you're dealing with objects of some significance, as the Kouros, there probably is enough money involved in it to pay a lot of people to create a provenance. But this adds just to the complexity. On the other hand, there are individuals who, for very legitimate personal reasons, do not want to be identified, whether it's a matter of just their individual privacy, other reasons of secrecy, which may well be legitimate. They may be illegitimate too. They may be tax evasion reasons, but make the establishment of a provenance very difficult. But I should also note that I have a little problem with museums being characterized as acquiring these because of lust for ownership. I think museums feel a responsibility both to the field, but also have a responsibility to their public. And our responsibility at the Getty Museum, really as an educational institution, and particularly as an educational institution on the West Coast, in a metropolitan area in which well over a majority of the individuals collectively come from minority groups who don't directly identify with Western civilization. And part of our objective, and also I might say at the intersection of the United States, Latin America, and the Far East, where we feel that we can, through the exhibition and explanation of the wonderful beauty of Greco-Roman antiquities, really do something significant in explaining and developing an understanding of the culture of Western civilization. So we do at times acquire, not often, but usually when we do, they're visible. And in that context, then, we do have a formal written policy of how we will approach objects. We have bought objects on occasion without a provenance. We publish them promptly. They fill an important void in our small collection. And our written policy says if at any time the country of origin can establish that fact, we will return the piece. But let's look at this in more of a systems context, if you will, for a moment. Many movable, well, let me start off this way. If you look at the sites, now what kind of sites are we talking about? Now there may be the occasional grave robber, but I think objects of any significance are more likely, I think, to come either from a site that's being excavated, or as likely from some commercial or industrial type of construction activity or development activity that suddenly unearths a site. Now, what's the responsibility of both the archaeologists and the government of origin in terms of overseeing those developments? We go beyond that. Developers are who uncover movable property, or certainly who uncover immovable property, are in many instances loath to let that come to light for several reasons. They can be delayed in their project at an enormous economic cost, for which the state will not reimburse them. On other instances, they can have their property expropriated in some form or other at far less than the value that they have placed on or what their cost is for the property. Now, I'm not putting this in terms of saying that they're right, but they're driven by economics. But the dynamics of the circumstances do suggest then that they are not going to allow the uncovery of these objects to come to light. In some fashion, the dynamics there and the punishment reward, if you will, needs to be recalibrated. But what happens to these objects once they are, assuming they are uncovered in an archaeological site? Beyond the contextual issue and the fact that the context will be published, those objects typically end up in the basement someplace, along with probably hundreds of thousands of other objects in storage in the museums in the countries of origin, where they are typically not well conserved, typically not on exhibition to benefit the public, and often not even available for scholarship. Now, for one, so where's the law taking, or what's happening now in terms of where are the trends? And I would agree with our chairman that this subject is increasingly a matter of concern, and is a matter of not only a lot of discussion, but increasingly, I think, a matter of some degree of movement and collaboration. For example, in 1993, an organization was formed called the International Association of Dealers in Ancient Art, with an effort on the part of the dealers themselves to establish a code of conduct. We'll see how well it works, but certainly our purchases, whenever we've made them, and there have not been that many, have been made through what appear to be reputable dealers. And we'll see whether the formation of such an organization and its own code of conduct will serve a salutary purpose. There's also under negotiation at this point a new treaty called UNIDROIT, involving a number of the countries of the world. We're represented, the United States is represented by the State Department. I might note that there was one museum council on the State Department team, and that was the council for the Getty Trust. I have another simple proposal in many respects that I think, apart from saying, there's enough responsibility to go around, and there's enough that can be done on many of our parts to dampen, if not eliminate, much of this problem. But I have a specific proposal, and that is that if the countries of origin would be willing to dig into their enormous collections and make some long-term loans to museums like the Getty to fill the voids that we have in our collection, so that we can well educate our public, our growing public, we certainly then would be much less inclined, if inclined at all, to continue to acquire antiquities, frankly, whether or not they have a provenance or have, by any stretch of the imagination, been looted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams, for having painted that very interesting canvas of the many imperatives that an institution such as yours, essentially museum and conservation institute, needs to follow, and also for that proposal, which does remind us that hands need to be stretched out on both sides. And that allows me to thank you, and now to give the floor to Professor Hirayama, who's going to put to you a great new togetherness proposal. Professor Hirayama.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, my English is not enough for me speech. Please allow me to speak in Japanese hereafter.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have been calling for the Red Cross movement for the world cultural heritage. The spirit of this movement is comparable to the humanitarian spirit of the Red Cross, which is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. The scheme is based upon my belief that supreme cultural assets of all ages, regardless of the country of origin and race, should be regarded and preserved as cultural assets of the entire humanity. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the end of the World War II, in which Japan was defeated and declared unconditional surrender to the Allied forces. Japan caused tremendous casualties, grave suffering, and great sorrow in the Asian Pacific countries. Learning from this devastating experience of war, Japan declared in its constitution not to use military forces abroad ever again. For 40-some years after the war, the world had been under great tension due to the East-West confrontation. However, in the last few years, with the disappearance of such East-West confrontation and the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Russia, and we were hoping that the peaceful world may come about. Although major international tensions have disappeared, but in reality, we still witness a various ethnic strife or religious conflicts. And North-South problems or other disputes are increasing in their number and becoming rampant locally. In other words, disputes have increased in numbers. The United Nations is making its utmost efforts politically and economically to resolve these problems. But in some cases, United Nations has been forced to impose some military pressure or economic sanctions. So the United Nations has been sending peacekeeping forces and carrying out peacekeeping operations. However, the all-out resolution has not been brought about either. My country, Japan, has been cooperating with the United Nations within the limits of the constitutions and has sent its own PKO troops. Nevertheless, this issue remains extremely difficult and sensitive political issue within Japan. Internationally, much is expected of Japan using the Japanese economic power, and the majority of the Japanese are fully aware of this importance of international contribution. In 1945, I was exposed to radiation in Hiroshima at the age of 15 when I was a secondary school student. In my school, 188 students and 13 faculty members, in total of 201 perished on the spot. At that time, I saw the B-29 bomber flying over my head 10,000 meters above myself. I ran back to a nearby storehouse to tell my friend that I saw some parachute coming down. And this is how I survived the bomb. Just a matter of few seconds allowed me the narrow escape from the death. But I suffered from a grave after effects of radiation, and for a quite long time of over 10 years, I had a very severe time. And through this experience, I was determined to paint works depicting prayers for peace. I exhibited my painting in 1959 with the theme of the transmission of Buddhism. Ever since then, I have been working on the overall theme of peace. The Buddhism originated in India in 600 BC and reached Japan in the mid-6th century or the early 6th century via China. The Buddhist culture propagated throughout the East Orient, but it is also influenced by the Hellenism of the Western world, which spread to the eastward area. And I have made more than 100 trips to these areas of the Silk Road to see the origin of such culture and the intermingling of the East and West. And I have been creating paintings on that. It is said that Japan, at the far eastern corner of the world, has its own culture, but has been very much influenced by both Eastern and Western cultures. I trotted along the Silk Road, and I saw what damage took place there because of wars, conflicts, and natural decay, and looting and theft. From 19th century to the 20th century, the European or the American advanced countries tried to excavate buried culture and civilization and conducted archaeological studies. The British Museum, Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, the various exhibits are there across the ages, race, and national boundaries. There has been a major competition, shall I say, in introducing such archaeological exhibits or the ancient civilization. But now, each originating countries became independent, and they are trying to preserve their cultural heritage on their own and try to study them. But economically, it has not been easy for such source countries to do that. From such a point of view, UNESCO has in the past saved the Abu-Simbel temple of Egypt from being submerged underwater, and also took initiative in orchestrating the restoration of Indonesia's Borobudur ruins. However, with the withdrawal of the United States and Great Britain from UNESCO, and also with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the economic and financial pressures are mounting on UNESCO. I do hope the UNESCO, the United States and Great Britain will return to UNESCO at the earliest possible timing. I have been working as the Goodwill Ambassador of the UNESCO and have visited many ruins in Asia-Pacific region. I have been working on the preservation of the stone ruins of Dunhuan in China. And at present, I am calling on the preservation of Angkor Wat ruins in Cambodia with the initiative of UNESCO and with the cooperation of France and other countries. And the restoration efforts of Angkor Wat ruins are starting. But there have been the civil wars over 20 years rampant in Cambodia that harmed the ruins, and also natural decay led to the destruction of the Angkor Wat ruins. Although peace came about, but looting and thefts are going on. Such a Angkor Wat ruins or Khmer civilization was built between 9th to 13th century, leaving a tremendous legacy of civilization to us. In restoring the Cambodian ruins, what's important is not the physical aspect as cultural heritage, but we like to restore the minds and hearts of the Cambodian people. Although invisible, their hearts were hurt and injured. The reason why I called for the Red Cross spirit for the cultural heritage, it is not for the physical restoration of the heritage, but we have to try to extend our hands to cure and heal the spiritual injuries of the people living there, so they can restore their sense of pride and dignity of their own civilization and heritage. We can work together and study such heritage, and that will lead to the restoration of their own pride in their culture, and that will lead to their own self-help efforts. Until then, we can continue to extend our technical cooperation and economic assistance. We can work together with our hands and with our toil and efforts. We can work together. This is the essence of the Red Cross spirit for cultural heritage. It is what Japan should be contributing. With the Civil War experience in the United States, the protection of freedom is considered very important. In French Revolution, the liberty, human rights, are considered very important to be protected from our devastating experiences of the World War II, causing so much sacrifice and damage. I think it's incumbent upon us, Japanese, to protect and preserve culture and cultural heritages. And with your cooperation, I'd like to continue to promote this movement. We have heard the views from each panelist, the various aspects of how to protect the excavated artifacts and objects of art. And from my experiences as an artist, I would like to solicit your cooperation in calling for the realization of the Red Cross for the World Cultural Heritage. Thank you.
Professor Hirayama, thank you very much for that very broad and high-spirited and high-minded call to arms, a summons to arms. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry that the panel has entered so deeply into the complexities of these issues that it has exceeded its allotted time very considerably, thereby reducing the time left for discussion. I hope you'll agree with me, though, that it has been worth all our while. I'm going to throw the floor open for comments, questions, discussion. When you do ask for the floor and when you speak, please identify yourself. It does help all of us. I see Danny Caravan, his hand is raised. Danny, you have the floor. The mic is on its way.
It was very interesting that if we look on the panel, we have about majority talking about how to survive object of art. And very little was talk about specific side work of art. If culture is only objects or elements, physical elements, I think culture will be, in a way, dull. I think culture is many other things, many other kinds of arts. But if we will concentrate here about the art that you can touch, that you can see, that you can go through, that you can live with, that you can have, that you can buy. So I think that we should think a lot how to preserve the specific side creation in the human heritage, cultural heritage. Professor Hirayama, I appreciate his ideas. I think it's a great idea to create some international organization to keep this beautiful heritage that's going to disappear before excavation or after excavation, or with not any need to excavation. But we have also to think that heritage is also the things we are doing today, that we did yesterday and we did in the beginning of the century. And those things are not in conscience of humankind. And we should find a way how, first of all, to preserve the thing that has been done in the beginning of the century, in the end of the last century, that in the new buildings of new cities and of old cities are going to be ruined completely and disappear. And also to find a way of things that has been done today that will be kept at least for 50 years to be again judged if they are really part of our heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny, for enlarging our perspective. As we see, the field is so huge when you get into it. Are there any other questions? If you do have comments, in order to allow a maximum number of people to take the floor, I would ask you to make them very brief. Do I see any hands raised? Yes, gentleman in the back of the hall there.
Hello, my name is Ben Okri. I just want to make a very brief comment and ask a very general question. I think, first of all, I want to thank the entire panel for your various contributions, particularly Professor Hirayama and the idea of the Red Cross for the healing spirit of ruins and world art, and Renfrew for his passionate statement about the lost art of Africa. Very quickly, I want to say that culture, of course, cultures are not just ruins and objects and archaeological finds, but ruins and objects and archaeological finds are the dreaming parts of culture. All you have to do is sit in front of a Benin bronze for long enough to find some very peculiar things happening to your consciousness. Objects are the dreaming parts of the human race. This cannot be stressed strongly enough. The cultures may not be contained in objects, but objects certainly contain and hide within them the most potent part, the most essential part of cultures. Poetry can be transferred and transmitted by word of mouth through generations and through many forms. Paintings, too, in some ways have their own ways of surviving, although they're just as perishable. But when we're talking about ruins, when we're talking about sculptings, I particularly want to make a statement about the sculptings and the traditions of Africa, which have been lost and which are continually being, as it were, transported and made to adorn the houses of people who are indifferent to the places, as it were, that they've come from. That the spirit of the Red Cross of Art be especially directed towards the continent of Africa, where the deprivation and the destruction of its past in terms of archaeological finds is much more severe. There's virtually no control over it. The people themselves collude in this process because of hunger and many other factors, as well as even reprehensible disrespect for the traditions of the past. And the question I want to ask the audience here is it possible that all of you, with your combined influences, actually make real this idea of a Red Cross for, the protection of the human arts? We're reaching a part of the century where wars and differences and all sorts of stupidities of our consciousnesses mean that we're eroding our past, and the more we erode our past, the more we make thin our future. This is a plea that I want to extend to all of you and would like you all to address as briefly as possible.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that appeal, which I think all of us can answer yes to. We're with you. I'm going to give the floor to one more person, to Alicia Barcena, and then I'm going to have to close because we were supposed to finish at 5:10. We can go until 5:15. I'd like to give the opportunity to the five co-panelists to make a statement, a summary, a rejoinder if they wish to. But before I do that, Alicia, please.
And I used to work in the Maya region for many years. And it seems to me that many archaeological sites are linked to also natural parks. But unfortunately, we also always think of preserving the archaeological sites and the natural parks, but very little about the indigenous peoples. Many of these peoples have still the culture in their hands. And I don't know if it's possible in this project of the Red Cross to incorporate the people that still has the culture with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for that. I'm now going to just go rightwards and ask each member of the panel if they would like to take the floor for about 50 seconds each. Harold Williams.
Well, I would certainly applaud at the Getty Trust would the idea of a Red Cross. Of course, we have a modest Red Cross of our own, and we know the magnitude of the problems, and we've been involved in the restoration of the wall paintings of the Nefertari tomb in Egypt. We too are in Dunhuan, China, at the wonderful caves and grottos. We're involved in the restoration of the historic center of Quito, Ecuador. We're involved with the preservation of the oldest known human footprint in Lake Tole in Africa, and many other places. But the needs are far greater than we can even begin to scratch the surface of. So the idea of, if we ever could mount a much more concentrated and consistent and committed and long-term program, it could certainly have a great deal of merit and value to our world and our culture broadly.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Professor Renfrew. Lord Renfrew.
I very much welcome the idea of a Red Cross, and I'd like to take up something that Harold Williams said that I think was very right, that one really must look to cooperation in these enterprises from the home governments. And that would be true, of course, for a Red Cross for the living cultural heritage, but just as true for the ancient cultural heritage. And I very much agree with, if we're talking about Egypt or Mexico or Greece or Rome, I think it's right that they have a duty to solve the problem also. And I think his idea of long-term loans for the world's museums so they can fulfill their educational objectives and in a way undercut the commercial trade in looted antiquities, I think it's a very important way forward, and the responsibility is not just with the buyer, it is with the host countries, and I think that was a very helpful suggestion.
Maybe we should do too is to see if we can't get the Minister of Culture to be at least on an equal level with the Minister of Tourism.
Yes, we would applaud that, sir. Thank you very much. Professor Levin, 50 seconds.
I hope you will believe my sincerity when I say again that I'm as deeply concerned with the context of works of art and with the cultural heritage as we see it as anyone. I feel it's a terrible shame that we have not had at this table a representative of the devil, namely the private collector. The private collector, to my mind, is a precious commodity in this world. He is an adventurer. He is a creator of cultural values. We would not appreciate or understand or care about the sculpture of Africa if it had not been for private collectors who were really the first to discover and appreciate, on whatever level they did, this great art that we all love and admire. I think that any solution to these problems, and I do believe there may be some, ought to take into account the possibility, the remaining possibility for the private collector. I believe that there ought to be some way we could make these two things compatible, to rationalize the process of excavation and rationalize the process of private collecting, for which there is no substitute, certainly not by people like myself.
Thank you, Professor Levin. I greatly regret to have to tell you that for technical reasons, we have been asked that to absolutely close the session now so that the hall can be prepared for the next session. I bow to these technical constraints and ask you to bear with me and do the same, and ask in particular Dr. Krenz to forfeit his turn to speak. And if I may just say to Professor Hirayama, huge thank you for the wonderful proposal that he's put to us, and as he's seen himself, how well it has been received. And I think on that note we can close, and I thank you very much. Thank you.